Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching this special telecast with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Well, history is not bereft of leaders who have inspired the imagination of communities and populations, or for that matter, even triggered revolutions. However, very few, if any, have had the kind of universal appeal or influence as that of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi's legacy and teachings have global influence, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Nelson Mandela, and from Ho Chi Minh and even the Dalai Lama. Nearly every great leader has sought to learn or borrow from the principles of this rare great man. In this special telecast today, we will analyze the impact that Mahatma Gandhi has had on the world. Joining me on the program today are Dr. Arvind Gupta, Director, Vivekananda International Foundation; Professor Imran Kovadia, University of Cape Town, South Africa; and Dr. Galina Alexieva, Head Research Department, Tolstoy Museum Estate, Russia. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this special telecast. All right, Mr. Gupta, let me start the program with you first. Let's try and analyze and understand the kind of impact that Mahatma Gandhi has had on the globe or the world.
You rightly observed, Frank, that he continues to be relevant today. The question that we have to ask is, why is he relevant even today? He was born in the 19th century and he died 72 years ago. The world has changed since then, and yet Mahatma Gandhi remains very relevant. And I think that is because the world is very troubled as we speak. There is a lot of violence in the world. There is a lot of inequality in the world. All kinds of protests are happening. Interstate relationships are all quite affected. And despite the enormous wealth that has been created in the world over the last few years, the world sorely misses something. There is little happiness, there is tension. COVID has created all kinds of uncertainties. So, and also we have weapons of mass destruction, all kinds of restraints which used to be there, they are going away. And I think people are asking for answers to those questions. And they turn to Mahatma Gandhi precisely because of what you said. I think his teachings are very universal. So although he lived and worked in a different era, but I think the reason for why his teachings are so universal are because he had based his life and thinking on two very important principles which he culled out from his readings and from his experiments. And one of them was the search for the truth. And he said, truth is God. Not God is truth, but truth is God. And the second is nonviolence. And from these twin principles, he derived the philosophy and the methodology of Satyagraha and the entire philosophy which dealt with politics, which dealt with social issues, and so on and so forth. But the fact that he had distilled these principles of non-violence and truth and self-realization from his readings of the Hindu scriptures, from the readings of Christianity and other religions of the world. He was influenced by Tolstoy, he was influenced by Theosophists, and so he was open to the ideas. But in the end, he distilled these principles for himself, and he found that the force of truth, which is really coming out of renunciation, that would be the most important force. And I think that is why he was really not interested in anything which is personal, and he was very confident because of that force of truth, and which was reflected in his methodology of Satyagraha. And he achieved many things, and that's why he continues to be relevant.
Okay, We'll come back to this point of his relevance as of today. I'll just come back to you, Imran, in just a bit. But before that, let me go across to Galina, because Arvind Gupta raised the issue of Tolstoy and, you know, how the friendship existed and how much the Mahatma learned from Tolstoy. And since we have the head of the research department of the Tolstoy Museum Estate, I must go across to her and find out from her. You know, let's talk about an aspect that is not very widely spoken about, the friendship really between Tolstoy and MK Gandhi, and what is it that they shared between each other? What is it that the principles, what common principles did they have?
In Tolstoy's spiritual universe, Gandhi occupied a very special place. And Tolstoy's personal library, which has been registered in the UNESCO World Heritage Documentary Heritage, reflects Tolstoy's interest in India and Tolstoy's interest in Gandhi's activities. Through Taraknath Das and Mahatma Gandhi, Tolstoy became acquainted about the Indian independent movement. And you know, in the last years of Tolstoy's life, in the last decade of his life, Yasnaya Polyana became a very special Russian Mecca where so many pilgrims used to come. And one of them was from India. He was the journalist from the Indian magazine, The Light of India. His name was Pundit N. Krishna. He interviewed Tolstoy about the same issues which Gandhi and Lev Tolstoy were united. The ideas of non-violence and civil disobedience. When Tolstoy knew about Indian independent movement and about Gandhi's activities, he became greatly interested in Gandhi because he understood that Tolstoy's appreciation of ideas of nonviolence and also the ideas of nonviolence proclaimed by the American abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, the American philosopher, transcendentalist, and poet Henry David Thoreau were the same. And they say now that Thoreau was the seed, Tolstoy was the tree, and Gandhi was the fruit. Tolstoy-Gandhi's correspondence began during the last year of Tolstoy's life, from October 1909 till October 1910, when Tolstoy left Yasnaya Polyana and died several years later. But their correspondence, Tolstoy and Gandhi's letters, they reflect their similarity in appreciation, the ideas of nonviolence and civil disobedience. And Gandhi sent the book, with one of his letters, the book about Gandhi, written by Joseph Doak, was sent. And Tolstoy read this book with a pencil in his hand. And this book is in his study on the shelf. And Tolstoy's favorite pencil note, NB, nota bene. There are so many nota benes on the pages of the book Mahatma Gandhi as a patriot in South Africa. So, and this book gave Tolstoy more information about Gandhi.
Right. So talking about South Africa, then Imran, I'll have to bring you in now. You know, we know the connection that the Mahatma had with South Africa. It's all well documented. You know, we study it in our history books as well, and we know that South Africa as a nation too, through Nelson Mandela, has taken a lot in from Mahatma Gandhi and has taken it forward as well. Take us through that.
Well, I agree entirely with what Galina said. I've actually just finished writing a book, or published a book, about Gandhi, Mandela, and Tolstoy. And I thought one interesting thing to think about, one of the many things they have in common, and Gandhi read Tolstoy very closely. Tolstoy, as Galina has pointed out, was very attracted by the idea of Gandhi. Mandela, interestingly, the only novel he talks about at length is War and Peace, which he read on Robben Island. And he read it because the prison censors had forgotten to take it out. They were trying to take out all the books with war in the title, and they forgot to take out War and Peace. So he ended up reading it. And it's the only book he really talks about in terms of leadership in his entire life, all his journals and letters. And he singles out from that book one character, Field Marshal Kutuzov, right, who is the kind of historical spirit of the novel. And the interesting thing about Kutuzov is that he was a general, a field marshal. He was a military commander, so he was a man of violence. At the same time, Tolstoy makes him a man of mercy and charity. He says that he's the strangest kind of military commander because he spares human life. Right? He's interested in reducing violence. And clearly, Mandela saw that as a very important part of his own understanding of leadership. But Gandhi's, we often talk about Gandhi's apprenticeship in South Africa. I think in many ways, South Africa was a kind of trivializing and brutalizing environment for him. I mean, obviously, within days of getting into the country, he'd gotten into numerous fights, been thrown out of a courtroom and a train and assaulted on a stagecoach. And what's interesting about those first 10 or 15 years is he's kind of making his way towards a radical vision of the kind he finally finds in Leo Tolstoy in kind of 1905 and 1906, and of course through their correspondence. And I think if I can mention just one or two of the aspects of that, one very important thing they have in common is an interest in manual labor, in getting your hands dirty. When Tolstoy decided to do his own laundry, or when Mandela, as president, insisted on making his own bed, even though he was the president, insisted on shining his own shoes, or when Tolstoy insisted on making his own sandals. What they were telling us is that there can't be a separate, even with the most powerful and most extraordinary human beings in the world, there must never be a separation between them and ordinary people, and ordinary work must always be honored. I think that's one thing. The other thing that they have given us is an amazing ability to incarnate these vast collectivities, right? Gandhi with India, Tolstoy with Russia, Nelson Mandela with Africa and South Africa, and yet to incarnate them without antagonism. Tolstoy's patriotism, such as it was, like Mandela's patriotism, has no enemy, has no enmity in it whatsoever. And I think that's another way in which they're extremely valuable to us today.
Absolutely. All right, taking the discussion forward now, Mr. Gupta, let me come across to you. There's no doubt that Mahatma Gandhi is regarded by many as the greatest leader of the Indian independence movement. But let's talk about another aspect. What kind of an impact has he had on movements and leaders around the world?
Gandhi turns out to be an arch protester. He's protesting forever. He's protesting against the system. He's standing with someone, securing somebody's rights. And he is also a rebel. As he said, he has very radical, unorthodox views. He is also trying to reform things, but he was, of course, never in power. So he is always trying to reform maybe people's mind, changing mindsets, trying to mobilize people. So the entire life, he is trying to do something and trying to change something. And he is himself the agent of change. So I think this aspect of Gandhi has influenced many people. And today we see that the protest movements across the world, they study Gandhi and take something out of his lives and works. I mean, you mentioned Ho Chi Minh, for instance. Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is a revolutionary. And he says that Gandhi is our guide. So I think Gandhi is very important for most of people who are trying to protest and change things. So I think that is one of the greatest impacts that Gandhi has had. But at the same time, as I said, Gandhi is also deeply spiritual. And I think his thoughts on morality, he sees and his views on ends and means, and the fact that he is essentially searching for the truth. I think this is a philosophical aspect which also has impressed people. And today, when we see that the world is so conflicted, what is the role of morality? I think that is also people are trying to study. What is the role of morality in our daily lives, in interstate relations, and so many other things that we do. So Gandhi sets very high standards for himself, and you see, he doesn't preach unless he himself is convinced of something. He is not. There is no difference between what he says and what he does. So I think that also impresses people. And he himself sets so high standards for himself that he says that look, he has not reached where he would have liked to reach. So I think these attributes of Gandhi also impress people, and we must see Gandhi beyond politics also. That is very important, and that is, I think, one reason why he is relevant today.
Absolutely. All right. So, talking about his relevance, let's talk about a couple of his principles. Galina, you brought that up in your opening remarks about civil disobedience and non-violence. If you look at the world today, there is violence practically everywhere. We've seen several groups and several nations taking up arms against each other at a time when everyone is busy fighting with missiles and talking about, nuclear warheads. How relevant is something like a civil disobedience or non-violence?
I think even in that time, in Tolstoy's time and Gandhi's time, at the turn of the century, I think the world was full of aggression and full of weapons, and the wars were here and there, and that is why so many people from Europe, America, asked Tolstoy to raise his voice against this or that war. And of course, the ideas of civil disobedience and non-violence are very relevant even today. And people should read such articles and such essays like A Letter to Hindu, written by Tolstoy. Actually, it's a reply to Taraknat Das letter to Leo Tolstoy. And he wrote that letter, which became a real essay, A Letter to Hindu. In this letter, Tolstoy demonstrates his deep sympathy to the Indian independent movement, to the ideas of non-violence and civil disobedience, as Tolstoy himself understood them, and as Gandhi and the American abolitionists and the American pacifists understood those ideas of non-violence and civil disobedience. And I think nowadays we should read such addresses, such essays written by Tolstoy more than 125 or 130 years ago, just about peace and non-violence.
Okay. All right, Imran, let me bring you in now. As far as, this world is concerned, is there place for someone with radical views? When we talk about radicalism today, we always look at it with the perspective of terror, at some point. But let's keep terror aside and talk about someone with radical ideas, someone who is different, someone who is cut out of a different cloth. Is there place for someone like that in today's world?
I think more than a place, it's when we talk about radical thinking, we mean someone who reasons from first principles and tries to live according to those principles and practices a politics appropriate to those principles, from issues of non-violence in police relationships to civilians, to our relationship as human beings to animals, to our relationship to the environment. These ideas of non-violence are really probably the dominant and the most productive ideas of our time. If anything, the themes around which Gandhi seemed to falter in the 1940s, right? Religious violence, the atomic bomb, the rise of weaponry, which meant you could kill people from far away. If anything, the way that those things have developed has, I think, has many ways proved Gandhi right, or suggested the strength of his position. Why did we avoid an atomic holocaust, right? Why was there no showdown between the Soviet Union and the United States? It wasn't, these were highly antagonistic powers, but at the same time, Gandhi, Tolstoy, Emerson, Thoreau, Nelson Mandela, they belonged to a kind of international force of public opinion, right, which was strongly pacific and strongly opposed to the kind of wars that states wanted to fight with each other. It's true that Tolstoy's first letter to a Hindu was kind of opposed to terroristic violence, right? To kind of individuals fighting colonialism by terror. And he's clearly right. But I think the other thing that Gandhi, Tolstoy, and Mandela share is a certain skepticism about the violence of the state and even of the capacities of the state. And I think one way in which it can be radical is, in many ways, they help us to let go of the fixed ideas of the right and the left about the state, about community, and to think about what do communities have to do for themselves. What does it mean to use violence as a state against external, internal enemy? How do we use violence in our own lives? How do we liberate ourselves from those things? I think as individuals, those questions are alive, but also as social movements. I think Black Lives Matter turns out to have been the most numerously attended protest in American history, which is extraordinary given the history of that country. So
Absolutely.
I think they're right at the center of our world.
Absolutely. All right. So, Mr. Gupta, so what aspects of, Mahatma Gandhi's teachings, principles, and, just the way of life and the kind of, the way he lived life, what aspects of that do we need to take forward and do we need to teach our millennials?
See, just a second on the violence issue. I think if you try and resolve interstate conflicts using Gandhi's ideas today, I think it is not going to be that easy. If you talk about the violence of the kind that ISIS is perpetrating, that is not going to be easy. But then violence has many shades. And I think more violence there is, more relevant does non-violence become. I think that is and people pine for peace or peaceful, existence and living. So to that extent, I think we need to study more deeply what is violence, what is non-violence, and it is not just pacifism. That is a caricature of the thinking of Mahatma Gandhi. So what aspects I think we should take forward? I would think that, a few years ago, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution. It was in 2007. And Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, October 2nd, that became, now it is celebrated as a day of non-violence. So, and the last year, the UN Secretary General said something very interesting. He said that the UN's Agenda 2030 program is a flagship program. It is really Gandhi's idea of standing with the last person, leave no one behind, or in Gandhi's terminology, it would be called Sarvodaya. That is something that informs UN's function. So, in the sphere of peace, development, cooperation, I think Gandhi's ideas are very relevant. Equally today, when we talk about climate change and the environmental degradation and ecology, and which is actually related to greed, and Mahatma Gandhi had a lot to say about the greed and the overproduction, etc. I think that is another area which we take forward. And this whole issue of overconsumption is leading to this degradation of the planet. It is something that I think again Gandhi talked about. Then
Right.
I feel that today, in the context of globalization, when all the production is for profit and not necessarily just to generate wealth, but not how to distribute wealth, I think Gandhi's ideas put some kind of the wealth generation. And when he talked about trusteeship of the wealth, these are some very radical and ideas. This can be taken forward. And lastly, I think I would say that Gandhi is often painted as anti-modernization, who was against the railways, who was against modern medicine, etc., etc., who talked about the village as a production unit and so on. But if we don't caricature these ideas and look at these ideas deeply, then you find that they have a truth even today. He was against the exploitative nature of modernization. So I think some of these questions which have risen because climate change has become an existential threat, it should be related to this.
Absolutely. All right. So, Galina, very quickly, how do we take the message and the principles and the tenets of people like Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Mandela forward?
I think the ideas of love, universal brotherhood, moral self-perfection, and non-violence just are very essential now. And I think that there is no way out. This is the only path for humanity to survive.
Okay, all right. And Imran, close the show for us with your concluding remarks. You can probably take that question about millennials that I asked Arvind Gupta as well, because you deal with students and with
Yeah.
youngsters at the university.
Well, maybe I can tell millennials who to vote for. Um, Gandhi said that, and it's true again for Mandela and Tosu. He said, I'm only in politics because through the political lies my personal liberation. And what he means by that is the quest for self-perfection, self-improvement. I don't mean in a vain way. I mean the quest for always becoming an individually better person and the quest to pursue better political and social projects are linked together. So there's some politicians, you see them, this is not a person who's interested in being a better person. Right? Try and find the politicians who seem to be in that process of movement and self-examination and on the way to improving themselves.
Absolutely. All right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of the special telecast. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that the teachings of Gandhi are very relevant even today, and it is for good reason that his principles are still followed even 70 years after his demise. With that, it's a wrap. See you again.